Neil Haugen here for Practical Premiere, and in this episode, we're going to show how easy it is to roll your own normalizations for log media in Adobe's Premiere Pro.
Practical Premiere is sponsored by Creativity-Hive. Where we not only upgrade your video post-production skills, we make it fun.
This is kind of a follow-on to my Adobe Max 2021 online presentation of Session 565, Thinking Like a Colorist, Color Correction in Adobe Premiere Pro. If you haven't seen that, I recommend viewing it, but if not, what I'm going to be handling here is something that I didn't have time to do in the very short time I had for the presentation there, and that is normalizing the log media from this Sony A7S3 camera that was used in that shoot. And as you can see from the image up behind me, it's log-encoded media. It's kind of gray looking because the saturation is low and also the contrast is low. But although most people think that, well, you need to have the manufacturer let to go ahead and make that look good, or to what is called normalize, I'm going to show how easy it is to do that yourself. And in fact, why you might want to do it yourself, because most of the pro colorists I know and work with on a regular basis may download the manufacturer LUTs, but quite frequently they'll load the manufacturer LUTs to see what the manufacturer does, but they'll also have all kinds of things that they will want to do in order to match that camera into the other cameras that they're working with on any particular project. And so they'll end up just checking the manufacturer LUTs to see what it does, and then they'll roll their own and add in their own special sauce to it to make it look even better. And I'm going to show you how to do both a basic normalization and how to add a little bit of special sauce into it to improve it past what the manufacturer LUT might do. So let's get going. Well, I said we were going to add a little extra sauce, but we're going to do that right off to the beginning because, you see, there's a difference in the way film and our eyes and digital capture all work, but our eyes and film were pretty close together, and digital capture is the odd man out. It's the different one. Now, our eyes and film both really roll off saturation in the dark values. The really dark colors don't carry a lot of saturation that we notice. And again, in the light values, our eyes and film don't carry saturation way into the bright tones, whereas digital capture carries saturation clear into the deep shadows and into the bright highlights. And another thing is that digital sensors capture saturation in more of, I think, maybe you could say a linear fashion or something in our eyes, in that past a certain point, our eyes don't record that much more saturation, and digital capture just keeps piling it on. So between the two of them, the way images look when they're recorded on film, or we see them with our eyes, or they're on digital capture, the digital capture looks different. And we're going to set up something here that's going to take care of that right off the bat. And to do that, we're going to go into the Curves tab of Lumetri. And in fact, we're going to go down to the bottom of the Curves tab to the Luma versus Sat and the Sat versus Sat panels. Now, in any of these kinds of panels, the first term, Luma, which is, of course, brightness, luminance, is the horizontal axis of the panel, and the second term, sat, or saturation in this case, is the vertical axis. So in this panel, we have black to the left, whites to the right, and high saturated to the top, low saturated to the bottom. In the sat versus sat panel below it, we have saturation, zero saturation to the left, 100% saturation to the far right, and we have the amount of saturation coming in. Now, and of course, this first one is the amount of saturation that comes in from the image. The second one is the one that we're going to be affecting, how much it's up or down from the scale. So we're going to use these two to shape how color appears in the image, where it appears and where it appears most densely and where it appears less. So we're going to start with the Luma versus Sat, and I'm going to set a control point at about 20% of the way up from the bottom. And then we'll grab a control point at the far left end, and we're going to pull it down. And this is going to see to it that our blacks stay black and don't get a hint of a tone in it. And we're going to round that off a little bit. And then maybe somewhere up around towards 60%, I'm going to set another control point, grab the far end, and bring it down, and maybe just give a little bit of a softer curve to the upper section here, because what this is going to do is see to it that the black tones stay black no matter what happens in the color, and that the white tones tend to stay white. Now, with saturation versus saturation, we're going to shape where saturation appears compared to where our eyes would see. Remember, I said that our eyes see saturation and kind of roll it off as it gets more and more saturated, and digital doesn't. Well, we're going to use this to fix that. But the first thing is we're going to click on the, again, about 20% in from the left, and then pull the left edge down to, again, make sure that the low saturated colors stay low saturated. And by the way, when you do this with the curves, we're going to end up here. You can pump a lot of saturation in here without affecting your neutrals, which is really nice. And again, somewhere roughly about 60%, we're going to set a control point, bring it down way down on the right end, and then again, curve this out just a little bit there. Notice they're roughly similar controls, but between the two of them, if we come over here and bring up our controls, let's watch and see what happens in our red and our blue values here, and in the vector scope when I turn this on and off. And you notice with it off, the red is quite a bit higher than the blue, and yet when I turn it on like there, you notice how the red and the blue are much closer in tops, because we've now, the white points are actually have been taken care of quite a bit by this. And looking at our vector scope up here in the upper right corner, you notice with it off, we've got a more dispersed set of colors, and now we've got a tighter point in towards the where all the colors converge right here at the center, which is white or black, gray, neutral colors. So now that we've got that set, let's go and start doing normalization work on the image. And we're going to go back to the Basic tab. Now, one of the first things to do is, again, look at the scopes. I'm going to bring up the scopes big. The waveform in YC No Chroma is my favorite scope to use just for looking at tonal evaluations. And you can see, because it's the brightest amount of trace is this area right across here between 35 and 40. That's where most of the image data of this image lays. And you can tell it's log because there's nothing below 15 and nothing below about 82 or so. Well, when we look at the image, though, this is a summertime image, right? And it should be a fair amount of brightness and all in it, you would expect. But if we look at this and we think of what the contrast control does in Lumetri, the contrast control has a pivot point that is set right at 50. So you look at these IRE numbers over here, as they're called, on the far left. 50 is the middle, 0 to 100. With the pivot for the contrast control being right at 50 IRE, that means that anything above this is going to go up, anything below it is going to go down. So if I start adding in contrast to the image, note how much of the image data has gone down. Well, let's come over here to the image and check that. And yeah, I've made this image dark and a lot heavier than you would really expect. So that is not really the control that I want to use. But Lumetri comes to the rescue with something called processing order. If we look over here in the Lumetri panel, let's reset the contrast. You notice that exposure is on top of contrast, which is before highlights, which is before shadows and before whites and blacks. That is the processing order that these controls are applied in. Now, exposure is an interesting control. It's kind of like a gamma control in that it affects the midtones more than anything else, and midtones and the upper tones, but it kind of tends to roll off the highlight tones. It doesn't just push the whites all the way up. It just kind of rolls them off a little bit. So it can be a very useful tool for something like this. And I'm going to bring up the scopes and watch over in the scopes as I bring up the exposure control, and notice how, although I'm bringing up the white some, I'm bringing the midtones up a whole lot. And now that I've got the midtones up around that 50 IRE point, maybe even just a little bit less than that, now let's go ahead and start bringing in contrast. And again, we're not driving the whites out, but we're spreading out the total contrast. So let's take a look at what it looks like for the image now, and with what we've done. Okay, so looking at it that way, I think maybe we've widened out the contrast nicely, but let's go ahead and bring the shadows down a little bit here. So we bring the shadow detail down, which expends the contrast out a bit more. And again, looking at the image, and there we've gone a long way towards making this image look like a normal full range image. Now that we have the tonal things handled, it's time to, of course, go after the color. And a lot of people head right to the temperature and tint knobs. But the first thing I'm going to do is let's go back over here to the scopes. And, we don't have as much color in here as I would really like to see. I want to expand this color out before I start correcting it, because I really want to see what color there is in the image. So we'll come over here and to the saturation control and lift saturation. Of course, you have two kinds of contrast in an image. You have color contrast, which is chrominance or chroma contrast, and you have luma or luminance contrast, which is what people think of as your standard contrast, your total contrast. So we now have this image that goes from here, which is very definitely log, to here, which is, well, nicely corrected, except for, of course, the color is off. But we still have plenty of color, but not we aren't exceeding any color that we shouldn't be exceeding. So the next thing is to get the color correction for color, what people think of as color balance. And a lot of people head right to the temp and tint controls, and I don't do it so much, because let's look at the temp and tint controls over here. And when I work the temp towards the blue, you notice the blue goes up and the red goes down, and I do it towards the amber side, and the red goes up and the blue goes down. The green doesn't tend to change. And tint, blue and red go up together when you go towards the magenta side, and blue and red go down together, and green goes up when you go towards the green side. Because what's actually happening with the temp and tint control is very much like coming over here to the curves, and it's like grabbing the RGB curve and pulling it down, and grabbing the blue curve endpoint and moving it up. And notice that with both of them, by the time you get down to the middle, we have half the correction that we have out here in the white point, and we have very little correction down here in the shadows. Well, remember, our eyes see color most definitely more here than we do up here. So this is changing color a lot where we don't really see it, and it's not changing color much where we normally tend to see it. So I'm not a person that tends to rely on the white balance controls. And so if I'm not going to be using the white balance control here, well, what am I going to use? Well, again, let's look back at the image. This image has an awful lot of midtones. I mean, even this whites of her shirt is actually more towards a midtone than a white. It's not anywhere near like the light area out here in the sun. And the color of her jeans and her skin tones, his skin tones and shirt, this is all more mid-toned, or actually almost shadow values. And where can I control those separately from the highlights? Oh, let's go to the Creative tab, the shadow tint controls, the highlight tint controls. And these are what I will use a lot of times to control things, especially as in this image, because the shadows are where so much of the color cast is. I can come over here and work the shadow tint control and get this in so that that is getting, oh, look at the blues of her jeans are doing a lot nicer, and her skin tone, the red of her lips and everything. Okay, that is vastly improved, and I can actually come back with just a little bit more yellow in the highlights, because it is a sunny day, right? And I want those highlights to stay yellow. We can see what we now have for the image. And again, with this, before that control, with those controls in, I've got quite a bit of color correction done in there, and that is really looking a lot better. But wait, there's more. One of the things that is a problem with A7S3 footage to a lot of my colorist friends is they feel that as you're looking over here on the scope, notice that the area that is probably her skin tones and that kind of skin-colored area of that bench is right in here. It's not up on the eye line where it's supposed to be. It's below it. And yet all those greens, there's nothing down here in the greens. They're from the yellow to the reds. And this is one of the problems that a lot of my colorist friends have with A7S3 footage, is it really compresses the yellow greens and the skin tone colors all into this narrow area in there, and it's not really natural. But there's an easy way to correct that too, and we're going to build that into our normalization by, again, going to the Curves tab. So we're going to come back down to the Hue versus Hue control in the Curves panel, and I'm going to set a control point on her skin, and I'm going to hit the, pick out a nice forehead place. I'm going to use Control, hold down Control while I click, so I get a 5x5 selection rather than a 1x1 pixel selection. And this would be the center point of where I selected on her skin. But remember, I said it's a problem with the yellow reds of the skin tones on through the yellow greens being too close together and kind of pushed together into a yellow-red area. So I'm going to set some more control points over here throughout the greens and towards cyan. And with the Lumetri panel pretty wide here for the controls, so that I get a little less fidgety control section here, because these controls work really fast. I've complained to the engineers, and they haven't changed anything yet, but because these controls are so sensitive to working. But I'm going to bring the control up. I'm going to make the image here a little bigger so we can see it. Now I'm going to bring up her skin tone a little bit more into the skin tone area. And as you can see over there in the scope, you can see that that I'm moving her skin tones up onto that area here, getting her skin tones closer to the eye line area there, maybe even just a little farther. And now I'm going to separate out some other tones. We're going to pull the yellows down a little bit, and we're going to pull the greens way down to start spreading those out. And bring this down here as a curve to lay it off so it's not too obvious. But notice, let's go with the large scopes and take a look at this as we get, this is what it was before I did the Hue versus Hue control, and this is after, where I've moved things over. Some things are over close to the skin tone or just past it, and then a lot of these yellow greens are down into the area below that. We've diffused out those colors that were all shoved together so much. And so let's look at the image while doing that. And yeah, her skin tones are now much more, and notice here that her skin tones aren't all that varied from, you look at her skin and you look at the greens back here, it's very similar, and you can also look at the tones here in the bench, but we turn it on and all of a sudden her skin is very much different from the background, and this area here, which is also fairly close to her skin tone, is separated from the background. So that is another massive improvement to this image and helps correct what some people see as one of the minor flaws in the Sony A7S3. I know a lot of people love the camera, and it does some pretty good images, but it's like every camera, you've got to do some things to make it look its best. So at this point, we have an image that has come from a long, long way. This is what it started as, and this is what we've got to, and yet it's really a very few steps going back and recounting things. Started with the Luma versus Sat and the Sat versus Sat changes to make the saturation fit in more with where our eyes see it and to limit certain things. And then we came back to the basic tab and we upped the exposure and then increased the contrast and then adjusted the highlight shadows. And I didn't mention, but I actually did pull the blacks down at one point just a little bit in order to get just a little bit more dark at the bottom. And then increased the saturation, and then went over to the Creative tab to use the Creative tab shadow tint and highlight tint controls to do the color balancing, to remove the color cast from the image. And then to fix an issue with the sensor or the image, we went over to the Hue versus Hue in the Curves tab to make another little change. And notice we haven't even touched the color wheels or HSL secondary yet, and yet we've been able to do a full normalization of a log image to a very nice image, one that we could easily balance with other cameras now. This is how easy it is to do normalization of images of basically any log image by hand in Premiere Pro in Lumetri. And it's one of the reasons why so many colorists like to do their own. And I encourage you to get a little practice at this because it's a very good thing to learn, and it can help you balance out things because you can work with the curves controls or some of the others so that you can even adjust things so like a particular camera may be just a little bit more yellow with one lens or another, and you can actually build a control to handle that sort of thing if you know what you're doing. So, Neil Haugen for Practical Premiere. Go play with some color, and who knows, next time we're going to be dealing with sound or graphics or whatnot because this is all fun, and we're going to have a great time at it. Catch you later.